Hello and welcome once again to the Fair Game podcast, We Love You Football. I'm Graham Miller, and in this episode, we'll be discussing the Owners and Directors Test, often known as the Fit and Proper Person Test. It was brought in, of course, to make sure that those people who run our football clubs are individuals who are unlikely to bring the club or the game into disrepute. Now, pretty much every football fan listening will enjoy a huge belly laugh at that description. They can all tell stories of clubs where the test has appeared to fail and guffaw again at how others somehow manage to circumnavigate their way around the regulations. True or not, I think it's fair to say that's the general perception on the terraces. We have three experts in the field who are itching to tell us where and why the test has failed, and just as importantly, how it can be fixed. But first, as usual on the podcast, let's join Fair Game CEO Niall Cooper for the latest news from Fair Game Towers.
So this week, all eyes are turning to Westminster. It is finally the momentous moment that we've all been waiting for. We're expecting the King's Speech to announce for the very first time an independent regulator for English football. It is truly momentous. Of course, the devil will be in the detail, and we'll be lobbying hard to make sure that the regulator we do finally get has the teeth and the remit necessary to make the changes the game really needs. And all of that fell into sharp focus in our fantastic event at Birkbeck last Monday. On the panel that night, we saw Christina Philippou, arguably the nation's leading financial forensic expert into football, explain exactly how messed up football really is financially. Very insightful. She was followed by Damien Green, former Deputy Prime Minister, who of course now sits on the DCMS Select Committee. Damien outlined again the need for a regulator and some of the issues that have been concerning him over the last few years. Then it was the turn of representatives from two Fair Game clubs, Mark Palios from Tranmere Rovers, the co-owner there, and Damien Irvine, the CEO of Ebbsfleet United. Both articulated really clearly why football needs to change and what sort of things could make a real fundamental difference to the game. The final panellist was Dave Kidson. Dave is a former Reading player, but perhaps most notably led fan protests outside the ground about the current ownerships just last weekend, and has been campaigning hard to see a change in governance in the game. But sadly, Reading aren't the only club in a lot of crisis at the moment. We've seen some amazing stories circulating from Sheffield Wednesday, and the fans there have been in uproar about the call from the owner for each of them to give £100 to help fund the club through a financial crisis that is of the owner's own making. And of course, there's still issues around Southend United and Scunthorpe, and so many other clubs are on the brink. That's exactly why we need a football regulator. So it all goes back to those eyes on the King's Speech this coming week. And of course, part of the King's Speech and that independent regulator could be a new owners and directors test. And that's exactly what we're looking at in today's podcast. So back to Graham.
Niall, thank you very much. So let me introduce our three experts who are going to explain what's wrong with the Fit and Proper Person Test and hopefully how we can fix it. First of all, we're joined by Stella Cooper, an academic researcher specialising in corruption in sport. Stella's also part of the Fair Game communications team. Chris Blackhurst, journalist, former editor of The Independent, and author of the new book, World's Biggest Cash Machine, all about the Glazers and Manchester United. And Martin Calladine, author of the book Fit and Proper People, among others, in which he's written in great detail about football's finances, warts and all. Let's start with you, Chris Blackhurst. Why is the test brought in to smarten up the game, would you say? Why has it fallen into such disrepute itself?
Well, if I look at the what I've written a book about, which is about the Glazers and Manchester United, there are two aspects that are striking about that. One is in relation to the test. One is the fact that they bought the club, which by any yardstick is the world's biggest football club, biggest on social media, biggest fan base, etc., etc. They bought the club entirely with borrowed money. They put in some equity themselves, although, as I say in the book, it looks as though they actually borrowed for that as well. So entirely borrowed money. And then the other fundamental, which when you talk to the fans as to why they don't like the Glazers and where it all went wrong with the Glazers, and it has gone wrong, I don't think there's any dispute about that. It really boils down to the very simple premise that in the eyes of the fans, the Glazers don't care about the club. They don't go to the games. They show little time. They do not engage with the fans. I mean, you can literally count on one hand the number of interviews they've ever given. Malcolm Glazer, the father, he said 33 words when they bought Manchester United. He used the American word franchise twice. He didn't call it a club. He didn't call it players. He didn't use the word community. And it's that aspect which upsets the fans the most. There's an argument that says, well, there's nothing illegal about borrowing. You can borrow. Roman Abramovich borrowed. At Chelsea, they had borrowings, but Abramovich actually went to the games, and the fans respected him for that. Quite how you alter the test to get this community aspect in, I'm not sure.
But it's not just Manchester United, is it? It's clubs up and down the land with fans saying it appears as if the governing body simply rubber stamp their applications and without due diligence.
Yeah, I make a point in the book of saying, I think it's Gary Neville, and Gary Neville towards in the final chapter, Gary Neville is talking about the fact that, let's call them the money men, ought to be excluded from coming into football. And I say you can't really do that. How on earth can you do that? I mean, it's a free market. But it is certainly the case that there are numerous examples, and one I give, I say the old ideal, which we would like to get back to, I think if we could, would be of the local person owning the club, possibly having made a successful business career. Now they're putting it back in the club. The last time that really happened in the Premiership, I need to check the date. I think it was Jack Walker, and it was Blackburn Rovers, and when they won the Premiership, he was literally 1995. He was crying his eyes out. So it was a very emotional interview. His team, his boyhood team, he ploughed millions into Blackburn Rovers. They'd won the Premiership. It was fantastic. The relevance of that is significant, which is the following year, and it literally was the following year, Sky changed football forever with huge TV rights. And that changed everything. And then suddenly you got the Americans, you got all these other people coming in, and they did not share the same communal bond as Jack Walker. And somehow we have to get back to that, because, and I'll stop now, but there is this complete divergence between fans and supporters for whom the club, any club, I mean, I'm from Barrow in Cumbria. Barrow is just important. Barrow Football Club is just as important to the people of Barrow as Manchester United is to Manchester. Let's not be under no illusion about that. And we have to get back to a point where something that is seen to represent and be at the very heart of the community, that has to be somehow embodied in the test for ownership, because that's where the diversion is.
Well, let's pick up on that point with you, Martin Calladine. One of your books is called The Ugly Game, Where Football's Gone Wrong. It wasn't always the case. Do you agree with Chris there that Sky was part of the situation that triggered the current situation, or are other factors in play as well?
Oh yeah, absolutely. The kind of financial turbocharging of the game has amplified the problems we have, and in a different way, it's brought in different kind of problem owners. So, we talked about the local boy made good. Well, one of my favourite old owners was George Reynolds of Darlington, who before he built the club a £20 million stadium, and then went bankrupt and went to prison for tax fraud. Had actually spent most of the 60s and 70s in prison for safe cracking and various forms of burglary. So their local lads made good were often shady in their own ways, and it was those people that we needed, and originally the fit and proper persons test for, with all of its flaws, and it's changed over time. The difficulty we have now is that we have people of enormous wealth who aren't going to go bankrupt at the top of the game, and they can afford tremendously good lawyers who, no matter how well written a test is, they can apply certain amounts of pressure, and for example, with Manchester City, that the incredible foot dragging that takes place with the investigations and their activities, there's a sense that there's a lack of will, I think, in the FA, the Premier League, and the EFL to enforce the improved tests that they do have, even as they try to stave off kind of independent regulation. So we're at a really difficult position, and the test is being asked to deal with everything from bringing in this, what Chris talked about, this people, the sense that people need to have a connection with their club, which is completely ill-equipped for. And I think, to be fair, they don't, the FA and the EFL don't try to pretend that could be done under the current system. And then the more communal garden thing of just stopping local crooks and criminals, bankrupts and people who've been to jail from taking over clubs and running them into the ground for other reasons. At the top of this, they all come from the same problem, which is that there's a perception that there's money to be made, and the financial distributions in the game are so out of whack that even people who might be considered relatively sensible, respectable business people can end up losing huge amounts of money and doing very bad things with clubs, because the problems of football go so much beyond merely how we regulate who owns it and how the whole game is managed.
Yeah, because it's meant to be fun, isn't it? And yet here we are, we're bedeviled by these financial irregularities and so on, clubs facing administration, possibly liquidation. Are you saying it's out of control? I mean, is there not a way that we can pull it back and get it back on track?
Yes, I believe so, and I think that, but it's a kind of a two-part thing. So I got the Crouch report in front of me, and that made a lot of recommendations for how to improve the owners and directors test, most of which have now been kind of preemptively adopted by the Premier League and the EFL. I still think that is inadequate in as far as it goes. And they talk about the language here is they're worried about people who are unsuited to custodianship of these important cultural assets, and directors who are being appointed without the assessment of their skills or qualifications, which is fine language, but that is not what the test is seeking to do, nor what is proposed to do. What they are going through is a continual process of tightening the requirements, of trying to weed people out. So, for example, now if you've ever had two companies go into administration in the last 10 years, not football clubs, but any companies, that would be enough to prevent you from passing the ODT, which is a massive, massive improvement. Really, really excellent news. Likewise, there is now any conviction for violence would be disqualifying. And when I first became interested in the ODT about 10 or 11 years ago, I read through the document and I was shocked at how scant it was, how brief, how little it covered. And I phoned up the FA and I said, well, look, it seems to me that if someone had done time for murder, the day they came out of prison, they'd be able to buy a football club. And they kind of hemmed and hawed a bit, and they said, well, we reserve the right to look at it on a case-by-case basis. That has now been taken care of. But what I think we need to look forward is, how do we go beyond that and actually look at the kind of the skills, the qualifications to run a club well, not merely to fail. So go beyond that. The baseline requirement. Just as we require, coaches, no matter how grand they are, to have coaching qualifications. We don't make any positive demands of coaches. We don't of owners. We don't look for skills. We don't look for the kinds of people that we'd want owning clubs. And they've always been very wary of doing that. On the report from the government on the independent regulator rules that out completely, and it must only be objective criteria. But we all know that when we hire people for jobs, we do that primarily on subjective criteria. And there are other sports in the US, for example, if someone wants to take over a club, they must, in the NFL, they need to get an approved vote of 2/3 of the existing owners. Now, that's not to say that that's a panacea. It's certainly possible, looking elsewhere in sports government, to see examples of how we look for positive criteria, for how we look at the kind of people who have the mindset to grow the sport and to look after their club with some degree of custodianship. And that's the thing that's not really being properly addressed, but I think needs to be, and whether that's through a form of maybe kind of licensing or ongoing measurement of factors like engagement with fans, to kind of push people towards the right kind of behaviours, and then at the same time reduce the financial pressures that lead some clubs to go under or owners to kind of go rogue.
Well, Stella Cooper, let's see if we can sort of bring in what was being said there. But the perception still remains that clubs are attracting the wrong type of owner, wrong type of director. What's your take? Why do you feel that is the case?
Well, it's really interesting to get started on this research that we're doing with Fair Game. So the aim of the Owners and Directors Test research is to base this much more in the community. It'd be really interesting to get your reflections on this as well. And I just think that lack of transparency still between the club and between the fans. So attracting the wrong director or the wrong owner, obviously there's incentives that you need to look at from who makes those decisions. And I think at the moment it's not quite clear on boards who is exactly responsible for picking directors and owners. So you've got incentives such as financial, but I feel like the reputational harm for clubs at the moment is something that's still not considered enough. It feels like there's a massive disconnect between the people making the decisions and the fans that are impacted by this. And there's also fans that have been fans of a club for longer than some of these people who are making the top decisions. So it's about really finding a way that we can have, obviously at Fair Game, we do a lot of fan-led research as well. And that's what we really want to introduce into this new research that we're doing, to really understand the perceptions of how people feel about their club and what sort of character they feel would best manage that club. Now, obviously, there'll be a lot of different opinions on that. And you don't just look at someone's character for why they'd be suitable for a club. But I definitely think that in terms of the new reforms that have been made to the Owners and Directors Test this year, there is one improvement that I am a fan of, and that is doing due diligence annually instead of when they just take over the club. So that's highly important, because it does mean that, quite like if you're applying for a job or something and you get background checks, that they're reviewed every now and then, especially in a position of high responsibility. Why would that not apply to any football club owner? So another problem I think as well is that, again, it's too easy for football to make excuses. Where if you look at American football, if you look at ice hockey, the Owners and Directors Test already in those industries is pretty strict. So this isn't exactly new stuff that we're calling for. This is really reasonable. And I think there needs to be a little bit more of fan engagement with who we think would be best for certain clubs. Okay. And also, really clear rules that are set out, but even more transparent, that if you have committed a crime overseas or in this country, to whatever extent, you cannot run a football club. It's crystal clear. It's just quite like any other, I think someone else mentioned a moment ago, any other business, business that you'd run or entity that you'd run, this would not be allowed. So I'm quite unsure as to how it's happened in football for so long.
How would the annual test work, though? I mean, just take Reading. They're in terrible trouble with their owner, Dai Yong. I mean, he passed the EFL test, even though we're told he's been involved with clubs in Belgium and China that have gone bust. And other reports say he failed the test when he tried to purchase Hull City a while back. I mean, how would it work with a club like that? You tell him to stand down. I mean, what about the finances then? How do you see it following through?
I guess, I suppose, with due diligence, if you're looking at other clubs that have failed in the past as well, you need to have a structured response, in that there's got to be a certain level where you draw the line and say you have not proved that you are financially able to run a club. First of all, I think if you've got a track record of failing at other clubs as well, and then when you look at Reading, there needs to be perhaps more of a baseline and foundation on how many times can you fail before you take on a new club. I don't think that's quite set out yet. And I also think you need to have details on if you did fail at a previous club, or if you have made mistakes, like why they've happened. And I think there needs to be some sort of reporting mechanism where the other people that have worked at those clubs with directors, with those owners that come into new clubs, where they can actually have a say on the person's suitability. I'm not quite sure on how the referencing system works for directors and owners coming to new clubs. But obviously, if you've failed at quite a few clubs previously, I'm not sure how shining your references would be. Are those taken into consideration?
Chris, would that work for you, or do you see other sanctions, or would you like to see other sanctions?
Listen, I think the fit and proper test is important. Don't get me wrong. It's absolutely important. But it is not the be-all and end-all. And I think there's a great danger here that we're all sort of going down this route of somebody's got convictions they can't own a football club. Well, in honestly, how often does that happen? If you actually look at what's wrong with football, what is wrong with football, it is that the small clubs are suffering. They haven't got the money. That isn't to do with people having convictions owning clubs. You can count on one hand about the number of people with convictions who've tried to buy football clubs. That's a sideshow. The real issue here is that the owners, the Glazers, are not criminals. Roman Abramovich might be subject to sanctions, but he's not technically a criminal. None of them are. The reality is that when they take over a club, they have to, I would say two things, or three things. One is, yes, they have to pass a fit and proper test. They nearly all do, by the way. The second, and however hard you make it, the second thing is they have to somehow, and I don't know how this can be framed, but they have to agree that they will pay due attention and consideration, and that must involve cash flowing through the game to the pyramid, this word pyramid of the game. And when you get to the very top, that pyramid falls away. The Glazers don't want the pyramid. Abramovich, none of these people want the pyramid. They're spending billions of pounds. They're owning, what they want is a European Super League. That's what they want, where there's no relegation, and that's what they want. And that isn't the pyramid. That's not Macclesfield, Stockport, Barrow, Chester, whatever it is. And then the other thing is, they must agree, as part of the ownership procedure, they must agree that a significant and a meaningful proportion, not something that's token, but there is a significant body representation on the board from the fans, and they have to have voting powers, and they have to have some sort of power, because otherwise nothing will change. And if you look at what's wrong with football is not this fit and proper test. I mean, honestly, it's not. What the fans are moaning about is the disconnect between the clubs and them. And that's true of all clubs. Sure, there have been instances of criminals buying in. Look, I mean, I'm from Barrow. It wasn't that long ago that Curtis Warren, the Liverpool drug gangster, was busy trying to buy football clubs, including Barrow, to launder money. That actually happened, but it's rare. What we're really talking about the clubs that have gone bust, is the fact that money is not flowing through the game from top to bottom. That needs to change.
Well, can I ask you something then, Chris? Because I agree with a lot of that, but I also wonder if, because of the kinds of people we are allowing to take over clubs, that's accelerating. So like Roman Abramovich used football for his own purposes, just as Manchester City owners are. And both of those people are enormously popular with their fans, or were with their fans. And I'm not sure there would be any significant, a fan body on their board would have directed the club differently or changed anything that was done. Yet I still think both of those ownership groups have been detrimental to football generally by accelerating the move towards cutting off the rest of the pyramid and a European Super League.
Well, I agree with that. I don't disagree with that. I mean, I'm at risk of talking against myself, but I would stick to my other point, which is that they have to be part of the pyramid, and that's where it's going wrong. I mean, we're not on this to talk about Chelsea, Manchester United, Manchester City, Newcastle, clubs like that. The issue in the game is the clubs further down that are struggling. And that's where the problem is. They're at the heart of their communities, and we have to find a way of enabling them to survive and thrive. And that has to involve the bigger clubs who are attracting all the money and the moneyed people taking them over, who generally aren't criminals. They have to do their bit. They must do their bit. It must be part of the contract that they are going to, more money is going to be flowing down the game. We can filter out the bad apples, but that isn't the problem with the game.
Yeah, it seems to me that we there's a lot of stuff that could be done, but we never even consider it because we're completely unused to making demands of incredibly wealthy people, because we assume that would just be intolerable to them.
Well, that's exactly right. What happens is we fall back by default, and this is not a criticism because it's a practical thing. We fall back by default on the fit and proper test. It's the same in my own industry, by the way, in newspapers, exactly the same. We have the same arguments going round and round. We're having them now about the ownership of the Daily Telegraph. It's not confined to football. In fact, the test is very similar in newspapers as it is in football. But it hasn't stopped newspapers going bust all around the country. And in a way, we've got to grasp the nettle, as nasty as it is, and say, and it might be involving something intangible, but we have to put something in that guarantees, as part of the ownership test, that they will conform with the following. And if they don't, they are out. And if they don't like it, so be it.
I think part of that, yeah, I agree with that, is that what the EFL is scared of, really desperately doesn't want to do, is acknowledge the inevitable outcome of that, which is that there will come times when the EFL has to step in and run clubs for a period of time and be responsible for their transition to a new owner. And I could understand why they would be desperately scared of doing that.
Yeah, I mean, look, I was under no doubt doing my book on United and the Glazers that the European Super League is going to come back. It's not gone away. If you've got American owners owning football clubs where they come from a background where, as I say, there's no relegation, the worst performing team gets first pick on the best college leavers for their team, it's going to come back. And football mustn't assume that it's gone away, because it absolutely has not. And we need to find a way of working within it.
You were talking about fans on the board earlier. The fans managed to stop the Super League when it was last mooted, a few years ago. Are you saying now that they've lost that battle? Are you really?
No, I'm not saying they've lost it, but it's not gone away. They might have won one battle. They've not won the war. And at some point, the owners are going to come back. They'll probably modify their proposals. From their point of view, they're investing huge amounts of money. They do not want the threat of relegation. I mean, Manchester United has been relegated 5 times in its history. If you're the Glazers or whoever it is, or Jim Ratcliffe, you don't want that. You don't want that threat. And you want to play in the Champions League. But that's at the very top of the game. We have to find a way of money flowing through. And as I say, focusing entirely on the fit and proper test, that to me is part of the solution, but it's not the solution. Criminals entering football is extremely rare, and they're found out. What we're really dealing with is the money not flowing down through the clubs, through the pyramid.
So, Martin, we've got the King's Speech coming up in Parliament very soon. We're likely to hear that a football regulator will be brought in. Is that the answer? Will that make the difference that we're looking for, do you think?
I think it has the potential to, but it won't immediately. So I think, in one sense, what's happened with the Crouch Report going forward is the biggest and most important and best reform of English football in its history. But the ambitions of it, which might have seemed impossible to achieve a few years ago, are already largely been achieved, which is that in terms of kind of the ownership tests, almost everything that's been has been suggested has been preemptively adopted as a way to try and presumably undermine the need for an independent regulator. And it's also forced, it's knocked heads together about a potential financial settlement between the EFL and the Premier League. I'm not convinced that what's been discussed broadly is the solution and stops the kind of financial distress and the bad incentives that there are for owners below the Premier League. But that's already something. I think the creation of that regulator is a great step forward. I think what needs to happen in this question is who will take that role on, what will their defined powers be, and how might those change over time? Will it save football overnight? No, it won't. I believe that the bill was supposed to come with the power to prevent clubs leaving to join to join a European Super League. That would be interesting to see how that's framed. So it's an enormous step forward, but it's by no means a panacea. And I think we will still continue to see clubs go bust all up and down the Championship for League One, League Two, and we will still continue to see at the top of the game, state owners, people who've been credibly accused of murder. We had someone like Roman Abramovich, who it was been open secret for a long time the source of his wealth was questionable. He couldn't get a visa to live in the UK for several years before he was removed, and he only lost control of the club because of the war in Ukraine. So it's a start, but this it isn't going to, I think, fundamentally change problems that the game faces.
You talk about knocking heads together. The Premier League will continue to have the money. They have the power. It's almost always down to them.
Yes, absolutely is. But I don't think that means is that we have to wait till they are kind of crushed by a really radical regulator. I still think there's things that can be done lower down the league, because we have a problem in beneath the Premiership, which is that club owners can't control themselves. They spend money they don't have it with the kind of because they're dreaming of the Premier League. There isn't sufficient penalty for owners from going under. We talked about various bits of American sport. Well, one of the things that they have to do in the NFL to assure the league that they have kind of ongoing financial reliability is that owners have to put a certain percentage of future contracts, I think it's 25%, into an escrow account. Owners in the US already accept that. I would like to see a situation where, as well as stricter test and kind of ongoing monitoring, that we require all owners of a club to place a significant amount, perhaps even as much as a year's expenditure for the club into an account, which would only be released to them on a successful sale of that club, so that there is a funding mechanism, so that the owners can no longer use the threat, which they're doing at the moment, to have, you see in Reading, in Sheffield Wednesday, clubs, their owners are suddenly like, oh, we can't afford to pay the tax man, we can't afford to pay the players this month. I think the first time that you fail to pay the players or the tax man is when the EFL draws down on that account, pays it, and removes you from the ownership of the club. It's a much more aggressive thing, and something that we rich people are unused to being treated that way. But something like that is going to have to happen, because the Premier League, whatever they give up and whatever the EFL accept voluntarily, or whatever a regulator proposes in terms of a reform of funding, will not remove completely that cliff edge between the Premier League and the Championship. It will not remove the desire of new owners who don't fully understand the game to come in, bump the club up a couple of divisions and become a Premier League club and get all of that sweet European money. We're going to have to save owners lower down the leagues from themselves, and not just the ones who we know to be criminals or dodgy, just because it does crazy things to people owning football clubs, and it is financially catastrophic for so many people who in other areas have been pretty decent business people.
Chris Martin there is talking about the clubs lower down the league. Your experience with the Glazers in particular, it still looks as if it is a bit of a cash cow, isn't it, for prospective foreign owners if they can get their grips on a Premier League club?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the rewards in the Premiership are huge, and if you can get a top club, I mean, they're not exactly the values are enormous, but it is a cash cow, and you can make money. But I think in terms of the regulator, I would say that I'm absolutely behind the regulator, provided the regulator is tough, and the regulator's got to be detached, because the way football works is you've got the Premier League, the FA, the EFL, and they are going to circle their wagons, and they're going to protect their own interests. This has to be a regulator who can cut across all that, who can actually lay down the rules and tell them what's what. And if they don't like it, tough. Because the history of football is of committees in, darkened rooms, committees mainly of men, sitting there deciding their own futures. And that has to stop. That's where one of the reasons that's one of the areas where it's gone wrong.
You say if they don't like it, tough. What powers would you like the regulator to have, or how do you see the teeth?
Look, I might be being a bit naive here, but I do think in order to get over this problem about football moving away from the community, being taken over by people who don't care about the community, it has to return to the community, and therefore we have to have some fan representation or even council representation. They have to be on the board. They have to be sitting there in the rooms with the directors of the club involved in the same decision making, because I can't see another way of bringing football back to the community. And one of the lessons, by the way, of the European Super League was that, and this was a lesson, it did come home to people. It really came home to people as to how much football mattered. The country was in uproar, and it was the Prime Minister, it was Prince William, it was everybody was screaming about, and suddenly you did realize that football matters, but we have to do something that's tangible and real and get the community back into the middle of the clubs. At the same time, I mean, it's a balancing act. You have to have the community, but you also have to have the people who've got the money, who are prepared to invest their money and take over the club. It's a very difficult area.
Football matters, and fans clearly have some power, Martin. Does that mean you're optimistic about the future?
Cautiously optimistic. The independent regulator provides an opportunity for us to build on, I think. But what Chris says, I think, is absolutely right. Is that there's a concern about how strong a regulator would be. We part of the problem we've had historically is that the EFL and the Premier League have been reluctant to enforce their own rules. There was an Al Jazeera documentary a year or two ago where they had EFL documentation from their legal department saying that they were aware that one of the people bidding for a club was not the ultimate beneficial owner of the source of funds, but that they were not going to do anything about it because they couldn't afford to. We saw Newcastle's owner bully his way past the Premier League with the application of government power as well. So, will they have the strength of character to avoid these kind of smoke-filled rooms, to not be seduced by that, to be able to rigorously enforce it? I'm not sure. But it gives me we've seen already some changes based on the fear that owners have of an independent regulator. So that must mean that they don't think it's entirely purposeless. But I do agree with Chris as well. It needs to go beyond that. I have crazy ideas. I would like to see a future government say that all professional clubs would have to sell 2% of their shares every year to their fans, to a point where the fans own 51% of it, and gradually transfer all of the clubs into the fan ownership. I don't think I'd be the only person who thinks that's never going to happen. But what's happened and what we've got now was pretty much unthinkable 5 years ago. There was really, the Conservative Party were not interested at all, and it's still not clear to me how they came to their current position. That's beyond what the Labour Party were proposing for a long time. So if we can stop and take a moment and think, well, that's progress of the sort. Obviously the owners will do their hardest to work their hardest to undo that, but there must be a possibility of further change. And as Chris said, people recognise that football matters to them. If we can find a situation where instead we create this narrative, people understand that every club going into trouble isn't just another club. It is an example of what's going on across football, of the same failings, the same forces, and help football fans to see themselves as one united group, a group of millions of people rather than 92 separate little pressure groups. Perhaps we can dream of better, but I don't know. I'm not holding my breath.
Stella, we're coming to the end of our conversation. I mean, there's an agreement here that more power needs to go to the fans. That's very much part of Fair Game's philosophy, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I think this research, which is going to be accompanied by all of your amazing contributions today will really go to represent that. I mean, we're talking about, we don't want to be dealing with, the Man U's, the Newcastles, but they do set important examples for us, and they do give us evidence and data to examine. And when you look at smaller clubs in much lower divisions, you can start to assess where the risks are, and perhaps where the fans can come in and help on the board, for example. But I think every club has a slightly different setup. We need to have accurate data on just how much representation fans get, how much a say that they get as well. It can be really unclear looking at smaller clubs as well, just how sort of prominent that is. But again, looking at the impact that it has on not just fans, I think it was Martin who mentioned, there's multiple dimensions of people it's affecting. So if we look at Reading, for example, I think they're always a really interesting case study because of their problems at the moment. You've even got the players that are affected by this as well. Their women's team, who was in the WSL, has now been relegated, but also because of that, they've had to become, though they're not professional anymore, so they're not paid as professional players. So if that's happening to the women's team, you've only got to think what might happen to the men's team eventually, even though, there's a substantial gap between the two. It's showing just how the damage is being created. So I think a kind of impact report on what financial disparity can create in clubs is really important. So yeah, this research is going to be it's going to be very broad, but picking up on the government as well, I think it was Chris that mentioned, that this hasn't been 5 years ago, it was looking very different, or it might have been Martin that said, I speak to DCMS at the moment, sort of area of the civil service that deal with the government white paper on football governance, and help release the Crouch Review. They did not really have a department for this a few years ago, and now they do. So I think there's also positive things that we need to take from this as well. That the fact with the regulator, it is bringing to the government's attention what needs to be done, and also the fact that this is only going to grow and it's only going to hopefully improve. But I agree with Chris, the regulator needs to be incredibly tough. The caliber of people that it will be dealing with is so high, and the money, the I guess the sort of standing of people and owners that it potentially may be having to tell off or prosecute could be high as well. So how much authority will this regulator have? I guess it is going to be evolving, but it needs to be fully backed by the government. And if the Conservatives' position ever seems unclear, then that will obviously damage it. So I think with the King's speech, that's going to be a really significant, hopefully, turning point for this. And I think multiple parties, like everyone from DCMS to the government, clubs, the FA, the EFL, all going to be keeping their ears pricked to sort of listen to what will come out of this. But I think from there, we'll be able to collate some really interesting ideas.
Yeah, so the mention of Reading as a long time but increasingly lapsed Reading fan, it's a thing very dear to my heart. But the thing I've been thinking about a lot the last few years is that fans talk about custodianship of their clubs, but I think there needs to be a cultural change amongst fans themselves. So, Dai Yong, for 3 years in a row, the club spent more than 200% of its income on wages, and for the majority of time, fans cheered that on, because that was evidence of ambition and a desire to get into the Premier League. And now everyone's against him because the wheels have come off completely. But still, most fans really what they want from an owner, whether I think they'd admit it or not, is they want an owner to come in and overspend successfully. Yeah. They don't want someone to come in and ruin the club. They want someone to buy them largely unearned success. And the thing that I've been most heartened by in recent years is the continuing growth and reputation of clubs like Wimbledon and Exeter, fan-owned clubs. But part of that comes with that is a recognition that under the current setup, we're not going to win anything. That that being good is going to have to be its own reward, and a lot of fans are still not ready for that. And we do need to, I think, to look at ourselves as fans and to say, if we really want our club to survive and be sustainable, we have to be prepared for meaning that we aren't going to challenge for trophies every year. We're not going to continue to have a new striker. We need to cheer an owner who says, I will not spend the money I do not have and the club cannot generate itself, rather than boo them and say that we need a new owner. And I began to fall out of love with Reading when John Majeski, who was that classic local boy made good, who invested in the football club because he wanted to give something back to the town, when he announced he couldn't really sustain the losses and take the club on, a lot of people cheered that. A lot of people said, this is brilliant. And we have gone through a series of terrible owners since, like a trading down again and again and again to the situation we're in currently. And that's not all on the regulation. That's not all on the other owners. Part of that is on fans, and we need to accept some responsibility for that.
Martin, Stella, and Chris, thank you so much for your time. It's been a very interesting conversation. If you've enjoyed it, do please subscribe to the Fair Game podcast. You can find it on all the usual channels. I'm Graham Miller. The producer is Ian Beach. Thank you for listening. And until the next edition of We Love You Football, it's goodbye for now.